Let's start off by talking about census data. So a census is a procedure of systematically calculating, acquiring, and recording information about given members of a population. Governments have been doing censuses for thousands of years. Some of the first recorded examples are there's a comprehensive census in China about 2,000 years ago. That's one of the first, most accurate census records. There are also censuses conducted in Egypt, in ancient Rome, and a variety of societies around the world. And as time has progressed, obviously censuses have become more accurate, and nowadays we do a whole bunch of different things with census data. So a census is often constructed as the opposite of a sample. So I talked about sampling last week. That's where we take a subset of a population and use it to extrapolate and assume patterns about a broader population. Whereas the goal of the census is to count everyone in a population rather than just a fraction. So part of the goal is to just know how many are within the population, and then another goal is to collect certain demographic information about that population. And census data is used to determine the distribution of resources for different administrative subdivisions. It's used to determine electoral boundaries and for a very wide variety of research purposes, some of which we're getting an introduction to in this course. Within the context of Canada, the Canadian Census has been going on for about 150 years or so. I actually just got my census form in the mail a couple weeks ago and filled it out. But basically, the Canadian Census has been recording information about the population, demographics information, for over 100 years. And so you can see this is essentially a population pyramid representing historical and then projected population patterns in Canada based off of the Canadian Census. So the census in Canada happens every 5 years. And so there's a short form, which is exhaustive. That is, they ask everyone to fill that out, or at least one member of every household to fill that out. So I live in a household with 2 roommates, and we got one form, and I filled it out for the 3 of us. And so the goal of that is to get a count of every person in the country. They ask a small number of questions, like your age and what languages you speak. And then there's a longer form, which is a sample, right? So again, we discussed sampling last week. That's taking a subset. And so it's just a random sample of 20% of the population where they ask people to fill out certain things. Just to get an idea of what are some of the questions on the census. So on the short form, they ask things like date of birth, sex, relationship to household members. So are you married, parents, children, roommates, what have you. The language spoken most often, other languages, the first language learned. Honestly, it seemed like 80% of the questions they asked on the census were just about language. And then in the long form, again, they have a lot more questions. It's much more detailed. It's designed to provide more information about people based on demographics, socio and economic characteristics. And so they ask like activities in daily living, like what's your primary mode of commute, socio-cultural information, mobility, place of birth, education, labor market and education status, housing. And so the long form is used to extrapolate and estimate these patterns for the full population. And so in Canada, there are a variety of census geographic units. So on the left side are the census geographical units that cover the entire country. And then on the right, there are some specially defined geographic units. So the largest census division is the province, followed by census divisions. which in BC coincides with regional districts, or in Nova Scotia, it coincides with counties. Somewhere like Alberta, it's arbitrary because they don't really have either regional districts or counties. And then below that, there are census subdivisions, and so those usually coincide with municipalities. So like Vancouver is a census subdivision. We worked with that in lab 2. And then the smallest unit is the dissemination area, and these are blocks that contain 400 to 700 people usually. And then there are some specially defined geographic units for doing finer analysis of specific areas. Two that we're going to focus on, or 3, I guess, are census metropolitan areas, census agglomeration areas, and then census tracts. So census metropolitan areas are just the largest cities in the country. These are regions that have more than 100,000 residents in a fairly densely concentrated area. So Metro Vancouver is a census metropolitan area. Metro Victoria is a separate census metropolitan area. And then census agglomeration areas are smaller, but still concentrated population centers. And then census tracts are subunits within census metropolitan areas. So I'll open up ARC and just take a look at some of these. So here I've got a map showing the geographic units, and then we'll look at some of the special units. So the largest unit is the provinces and the territories. Everyone's likely familiar with that. And then below that we have the census divisions. So you can see these break the country up into smaller bits, but they're still quite large. So if we zoom into BC, for instance, Metro Vancouver is one census division. Each census division is then subdivided into census subdivisions. And so you zoom in, you see within the context of Metro Vancouver, for instance, each municipality is its own census subdivision. So we have Vancouver, Burnaby, New Westminster, Surrey, Delta, Richmond, etc. And then below that is the census dissemination area. And so these are the smallest census unit, and they're very, very small depending on the context of where you are. Like in downtown Vancouver, for instance, very densely populated area, very, very small census divisions, sometimes the size of a city block or less. So again, census divisions or dissemination areas typically have between 400 to 700 people in them. You might notice in lab 2 that some of them have very large population counts above that, and that would be because like developments occurred. For instance, the False Creek Flats area has a really high population, and this will likely get subdivided into new dissemination areas for the next census. So these units cover the full country. The census dissemination area is a pretty large file because there's so many different little shapes to draw. And then we've also got these special divisions. So we've got census metropolitan areas and census agglomeration areas. So for instance, again, Metro Vancouver is its own census metropolitan area, or Port Alberni or rural is a census agglomeration area. And so within these, there are census tracts in the census metropolitan areas. The agglomeration areas don't contain census tracts. And so the census tracts are just divisions within census metro areas for looking at large urban centers. And again, they, compared to dissemination areas, are a bit bigger. So census tracts typically have between 2,000 and 7,000